Hello everyone, welcome back to another note video. Very exciting because this is the first set of notes of our last unit. We are almost done. Feels weird to say because I haven't seen you guys in like 2 months, but we're moving on forward. Now we won't finish the unit this week. We're going to split it over this week and next week, and then we will have a final exam since we are not taking an SOL. But we're entering the final countdown. Yikes. Anyway, so this week we are going to cover the end of the Middle Ages. We're going to go to war for over 100 years. Yes, you heard me right. And then we're going to go to war some more. And then we're going to talk about what all that war did to us. So, let's dive right in. Let's get going. So, when I say the late Middle Ages over the next couple of notes, I'm talking about the end of the Middle Ages. We've been talking about the Middle Ages over the past couple of really the last unit. Europe is a mess, but everywhere else is killing it. Europe is kind of stuck in this feudalistic manor system nonsense, and everywhere else is doing fantastic. Japan, Korea, China, Mongolia, Africa, the Middle East, everywhere else is doing really, really well. Just Europe is in a bit of a funk here. But we're heading towards the end of it. We're working our way out of it. You may hear people call it the late Middle Ages or the high Middle Ages, meaning we're starting to come out of the dark, right? We're getting a little bit higher, a little bit closer to the sun, closer to the light. So that's what those two words, two terms mean. And what we kind of characterize as the end of the Middle Ages is when Europe starts to get its act together. They start to organize, they start to structure stronger, centralized governments instead of relying on the church so much. And they start to look more like the Europe that we see on the map today. Getting countries we recognize, hearing names of like kings and queens we might recognize, etc. Let's talk about England first. So the British Isles, as we know from our trade routes and our movement notes, that the Anglo-Saxon people, the Angles and the Saxons, moved into the British Isles. And they had been pretty fractured for a long time, which means each tribe was kind of doing their own thing. We don't really see a united British Isles. So British Isles ruled by only one person. We see a number of smaller tribes. Two kings of different kind of sections end up fighting for a unified control over all of the British Isles, and their names are Harold and William. And they're fighting each other for, like I said, control over all of the British Isles, a unified Britain. This leads to something we call the Battle of Hastings in 1066 AD. Now, luckily for you guys, you aren't taking an SOL. You will still take a final exam for me. But well, the moral of my story here is there aren't many dates in world history that you need to know. There aren't many dates that world historians know. Things kind of happen so long ago that we lose records of it. Time has changed, etc. Calendars move around a lot. But so there aren't a lot of dates that you guys would need to know anyway in world history, and this would be one of them. Like I said, you're not taking the SOL, but you are taking an exam for my class, so we might want to, I don't know, we might want to highlight that. So the Battle of Hastings. Hastings is a place, a location, in 1066 AD, just under 1,000 years ago, sees Kings Harold and William fighting for control over Britain. William wins. He's actually French. He's actually from the Franks, Normandy. William of Normandy means he's William from the town or city of Normandy. Normandy's actually in France, so it's kind of weird here that we have someone with Frankish ancestors controlling Britain. And believe me, Britain has not forgot about it. But we call this the Norman Conquest because the kind of line of Normandy has conquered Britain, basically. Now, they don't impose French stuff, right? It is not like, oh, you're now a part of France. But um, his lineage is French, which is something interesting to know there. The tribes finally unified. They're officially unified, and they go on under the Norman conquest to be led by William. He earns another nickname, not William of Normandy. He earns William the Conqueror for his conquest. So you may have heard of him. And then England goes on to kind of look a little bit not so much like the England we know today, because their government has a significant change in a minute, but at least kind of similar to the England that we know today. They have a series of kings with absolute power. And absolute power, luckily, means exactly what it sounds like. Kings can do absolutely anything they want. We don't have, instances of, oh, maybe you shouldn't chop off his head for telling you your shoes are ugly, right? A king in this time period with absolute power can do whatever they want. Of course, not everything is well liked by their subjects, but if they want to raise taxes to 100%, everybody has to give all of their money to the king, or they want to say, oh, anybody who tells me they don't like my haircut has to, jump off a cliff. Nobody can tell them, hey, you can't do that. We do not have absolute power here in the United States. We have a system of checks and balances to try and limit what our officials in government can and can't do. Absolute power is common for a lot of monarchs, a lot of kings and queens, especially in these older civilizations, these older countries that we're talking about. Not so much today. But absolute power in the olden days becomes a problem with King John. King John. If you've ever seen Robin Hood, sometimes they use King John, sometimes they use Richard. So just flip back and forth. But if you've seen Robin Hood with the King John, this is the King John that they are talking about. King John sucked. He was a terrible king. He was really, really bad. He lost a ton of land to France, a ton of land that England had conquered. He loses it to France. He gets blamed for his nephew's death. Yes, it's very likely that he murdered his nephew so that he could keep power. Yikes. He gets excommunicated from the Catholic Church, which means they kick you out. They say you can't come back to the Catholic Church. You can't come to Mass services. You can't perform any of Catholic sacraments. And because you don't do those things, you're going to go to hell. Right? So they're basically saying you're going to go to hell. And he gets excommunicated because he had his murder. He murdered his nephew, yikes. And he also ends up causing a civil war. So losing land, murdering your nephew, getting kicked out of the country's church, and causing a civil war. Not good things. No, King John sucked. If you've ever heard of somebody refer to the toilet as the John, typically younger people don't do this, but you may have heard an older person say, I gotta go, I was sitting on the John. That nickname comes from how terrible King John was. It's named, the toilet, the waste receptacle, is named after how terrible he was. So that should tell you what people really thought about King John here. The nobles, the elite, the rich people, they get tired of him and his nonsense. He is such a terrible king, and they can't really do anything about it because King John has absolute power. So technically, he can do whatever he wants. But it's really dragging England down. It's making England into a mess. So the nobles get together. They write a document called the Magna Carta. Magna Carta. And it literally translates to Great Document. Yikes. And they force him to sign it in 1215 AD or CE, which is interesting because he has absolute power, so he doesn't have to sign it, but they basically said, sign this or we're, totally going to overthrow you and kill you. So if you want to stay in power, you're going to sign this thing. This is the first document, the Magna Carta, is the first document in history that we know of that limits the power of the king, and that's a big deal. So it takes away his absolute power. He no longer has absolute power. He has limited power. Okay? Absolute power, I can do absolutely whatever I want. Limited power, my power is limited. I can't do whatever I want. It also, the Magna Carta also creates a parliament. A parliament. England still has this today, although it's a little different. Nobles could, by nobles I mean rich people and stuff, they could be elected or appointed to the parliament to keep an eye on the king. Elected, obviously, people would be voting. Appointed means chosen. And they would become a member of this parliament and they would just keep an eye on the king. If the king wanted to raise taxes, they would have to go to parliament and say, hey, I want to raise these taxes. And parliament could say, yeah, okay, that's good. Or parliament could say, no, we're not doing that. Like I said, technically, England still has a parliament today, but it's a different type of parliament. It has a lot more power than the parliament under the Magna Carta. This document, this Magna Carta, actually goes on to influence the founding of the United States in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Okay, that's England. All right, France. Let's talk about France. France unites, just like England united under, after the Battle of Normandy, united under, Battle of Hastings, they united under William of Normandy. France finds its own unity under the Capetian dynasty. The Capetian dynasty. The specific guy's name is Hugh Capet. His last name is right here, right? Hugh Capet. But his family goes on to rule for a while, and they are called the Capetian dynasty. The Capet family has the Capetian dynasty. Some notable French kings. I don't think he's really important. I left him in here because the SOL mentions him sometimes. You don't have to worry too much about him since you're not taking it. But King Philippe II, he was also known as Philippe Augustus, probably just Philippe, not Felipe. He is the one who makes Paris the capital of France, which is still true today. So if you visit Paris, you're in the capital city of France. And France ends up kind of getting in a bit of a tussle with England here. In one of the most interesting, I don't know, I mean, war, I guess. It's just a weird occurrence called the 100 Years' War. Oh boy. Here we go. So, listen to me closely because it gets a little bit confusing. So, in 1328, the French king died and he didn't have a son. Remember that power is hereditary, meaning it's passed through your family, like your hair color or your eye color. Okay, so when the French king died, his son was supposed to take over, but he didn't have a son. Uh-oh. Who takes over now? Is it an uncle? Is it a cousin? Who takes over? Can't give it to the women because they don't know what power. They can't handle power. They're too delicate. She would just buy a bunch of shoes because that's all women do. The English king at the time, Edward III, says, well, my mom was technically French royalty, so I should be next in line for the crown. If I remember correctly, he's either an uncle or a cousin of the French king, Philippe VI. He says, no, women can't pass down power. And since you are claiming French royalty from your mom, you don't have any French claim to the throne because women can't pass down power because women are losers. Philip VI says, I am the closest male relative to the king, so I should be the French king. That's what starts this war, okay? The French king dies without a son. We have an English guy and a French guy who say they're next in line for the throne. This leads to a war that is 116 years long. 116 years. Oh my God. If we started a war this year, 2020, and it lasted for 116 years, this war would not be over until 2136. Yikes. Oh my goodness. This war is crazy long. And the kind of silly thing about it is, by the time that it's over, the two people who started it are long dead. Nobody lives 116 years old. And if they do, they're not probably going to be a very good king. Okay? Philippe VI Edward III, dead. So I don't even know why we were still fighting this, but whatever. This war gets a little interesting. It goes back and forth for a really long time. For a couple of years, it looks like France is going to win. For a couple of years, it looks like England's going to win. It just keeps going back and forth, until towards the end of the war. They don't know it yet, but we can look back and see it. Look, towards the end of the war, a young woman named Joan of Arc turns the tide for the French. We think this is the town where she was born, but we're not entirely sure. She was born a peasant, so we don't have a lot of paperwork about her birth and her early years. Let's talk about Joan. Joan is 14 years old. I think she was an orphan, if I remember correctly. She was definitely poor, living in the French countryside, just farming and stuff. And one day, she tells everyone that she has had a vision, that angels have come down and told her, Joan, you have to go and fight for the French king. By this time, it's Charles VII. Joan, you have to go and help Charles VII become the king of France. You have to kick out the English and help the French to victory, and you have to make Charles VII crowned. You have to have a coronation for him, which is like the big official ceremony where they put the crown on their head and say, you are the king of France now. Okay? So, she goes to the local, like, military guy and says, hey, my name is Joan. Hi. I'm 14 and angels told me that I'm supposed to, like, go to battle for Charles. So where do I sign up? And now, if it were me, I would have laughed this girl out of there, right? You're 14 years old and the angels told you that you're going to go to war. Go away. The local military guy was like, let's see if you can pass a religion quiz. And she's like, dope, I'm ready. And so he gives her like this like trivia test or whatever about Christianity to make sure that she was like really truly faithful, and she passed it. And he was like, wow, I think maybe the angels did talk to you. This sounds legit. Let's go talk to Charles. And Charles, she meets with him. Charles gives her a command over a section of the army. He's like, this is awesome. This 14-year-old girl, God told her, join the army, and she's doing it, and she's gonna help me win. I got God on my side. This is great. I got God and Joan. And everyone just like okay with it, I guess. She dresses in men's clothing. She wears armor, and she leads a section of the army into the Battle of Orleans. This is what I'm saying here, Orleans. If you want to put an English spin on, you can say Battle of Orleans. I know we're used to seeing New Orleans. Okay, true French pronunciation would be Orleans, but whatever. And so she leads him into this battle. She gets shot in the shoulder with an arrow. Now, if I got shot in the shoulder, I would just lay on the ground screaming. I would say, that's it. I'm dead. Goodbye, everyone. Somebody take care of Noodle for me. No. Joan of Arc takes the arrow and rips it out of her own shoulder and keeps fighting. What? This, by now, probably 15 or 16-year-old girl rips an arrow out of her own shoulder and goes back to battle. What in the world? Absolutely nuts. People really start to believe in her because they're like, oh my God, this girl just ripped an arrow out of her shoulder and just like went back to fighting. She must be like the next Jesus or something. And so people feel like they can't lose if they have Joan. Because they've got Joan, they must have God on their side because they sent Joan. And Joan keeps getting saved and keeps, winning these cool battles. And everybody just feels like, oh, we can do it. And so she really boosts up the French cause. She really makes them feel like they can win. Here's a Middle Ages drawing of her. And you can see we've got, it's hard to see, but these are angels, right? You can see their halos and wings. This one probably has wings behind her hair. Okay. You can see she's clearly feminine, but in battle gear and armor. Now, Charles VII goes on to get crowned. He gets crowned King of France, and the war eventually ends not too long after, but it doesn't end so positively for Joan of Arc. She gets captured by the British. She gets tried for being a witch, basically, and also wearing men's clothing, which was a crime. She kept dressing like a man, and they kept telling her, no, Joan, you have to dress like a woman and say that you're crazy. And she was like, no, I'm not crazy. And also, I'm going to wear men's clothes. And they were like, well, we're just going to set you on fire then. And so she gets burned at the stake. They literally tie you to a pole, and then around at the feet, they put like flammable stuff like hay and leaves and stick and stuff, and they just set it on fire, and everybody stands in the little town square and cheers while the person is burnt to death. A little bit gory, but the Middle Ages were kind of a mess. So even after Joan has died, even after she's been captured and killed, she's still a uniting figure for France. People kind of do it in her honor, right? We have to do this in memory of Joan. If I remember correctly, she goes on to become a saint. I believe she was canonized by the Catholic Church, which means they turned her into a saint. France goes on to win the 100 Years' War and keep French people, or mostly men, on the French throne. It's very likely that if England had won this war, France as a country might not have existed. It might have just been an extension of England, which is kind of interesting to think about. But they didn't. France wins thanks to Joan of Arc, 14-year-old who had visions of angels and ripped an arrow out of her arm. Crazy. This is a portrait of her. If we were in class, I would ask you, do you think that this was painted by an English artist or a French artist? Okay, and this is actually going to be your exit ticket. I want you to tell me, was this painted by a French artist or an English artist? Think about how the French and the English viewed her, and look at how she appears here in this. Look at everything that you see and explain your answer. Goodbye, everyone.